I'm Reverend Lisa Talbott, and my parish is Homer, Alaska. Homer is on the very end of the Kenai Peninsula. We are the end of the road. If you start driving from Highway 1 north, it ends here in our hometown in Homer. This is a really incredible community. We've got lots of fisher people that live here. We are the medical hub for the southern Kenai Peninsula, so people from across the bay and all over come here for medical services. And it's interesting being part of a missionary conference, particularly since I was raised in Alaska. So I'm a mission that serves my own home, a missionary who serves my own home state. And so we've had to consider what it means to be in mission in our community as a missionary conference. And for our church, that means looking at the needs in our community around us, in our neighbors, in seeing what services are already here and what gaps we need to stand in to help people lead a thriving, abundant life in Homer. There are lots of stereotypes about Alaska. It does not snow all the time. It is light outside. We don't live in igloos. We don't use dog sleds for our major mode of transportation. So there are a lot of myths about Alaska. Some of them are true. It is cold and dark in the winter time. In our particular part of Alaska, it's never dark 24 hours a day. And in fact, Homer is called the banana belt of Alaska because it doesn't get very cold in the winter time. Here we tend to have temperatures 30 to 40 degrees. A lot of times we'll have a lot more rain than we have snow, and it's actually a fun place that we can get out year-round and ski, snowshoe, walk on the beach. It's never too terribly cold, too terribly icy, and so we do have a lot of wonderful outdoor adventures and activities that we can do all year round. There are a lot of perceptions about Homer as well. One of our most popular bumper stickers that we see around town is that Homer is a quaint little drinking town with a fishing problem. And that perception of the acceptance of heavy alcohol use, heavy drug use, those are perceptions that as a community we're trying to combat, because Alaska does have a lot of true deep problems with domestic violence, with sexual assault, with drug and alcohol abuse. The winters are long and dark. It is very true that seasonal affective disorder affects a lot of people, and there are better and worse coping strategies. And so one of the ideals of our community coalition is to change that sense of normality of Homer being a drinking town, and instead have it a place where people are healthy, where they're happy, where they're outdoors and active. And so a lot of our community work does surround working to change the community norms that even we as residents of Homer have about our town. Our conference used to be known as the Alaska Missionary Conference, and many years ago our name was changed to the Alaska United Methodist Conference, because in Alaska the term missionary is not always a positive one, that there have been many historical hurts that have happened, hurts that have passed down through generations. The church has not always been in ministry with Alaska Natives. And that is certainly a change that I think I've seen in our denomination, that our focus is no longer ministry to people, it's ministry with people. It's about partnership. How can we pair with people? How can we walk alongside people? And how can we work together? That's certainly something that we see in Alaska, the need to be in ministry with every segment of our community, those that whether it is a racial or a cultural or an ethnic community, or whether it is people who are suffering from addiction or alcoholism or domestic violence or any of the other many social issues that people face in Alaska, that ministry is no longer something that we do to people. Ministry is something that we do with people, as we recognize that everyone is a beloved child of God and everyone is our neighbor who we are to love as ourselves. And so the name change in our conference, I think, also signaled a mission-focused change, that ministry was no longer something we were going to do to people. It was going to be something that we do together. Homer United Methodist Church has a long history of loving our neighbors in tangible ways. Several decades ago, a safe house network was created with members of the congregation in order to help people who were fleeing from situations of domestic violence and abuse. That network became so strong it expanded to other families in the community, other churches in the community, and eventually a nonprofit was born from that, the Haven House, which is our domestic violence shelter in town. Haven House works not just with women and children to help them have a safe place to go if there is domestic violence or abuse at home, but they also have programs that start at a very early age, like Girls on the Run, which is a program for elementary and middle school girls to give them positive self-esteem, good body imagery, healthy coping techniques, exercise. Girls on the Run, they do 5Ks several times a year. They have an exercise program. They hook girls up with mentors who can help them through some of the challenging times of their life and give them the self-confidence they need in order to have really healthy, positive coping skills as adults. Haven House was born out of the United Methodist Church, and it's still a ministry in town that we support. Every year our United Methodist women make blankets for all the beds at Haven House and make plenty of extras, so any mother, any child, any woman who goes through there has a blanket that they can take with them. So many times when people have to leave their homes because of domestic abuse, they can't take their belongings with them. They lose their comfort items, they lose their memories sometimes. And so having a fleece blanket, having a teddy bear, having something that the shelter can give them provides them some of that tangible love from our church, to know that they're not alone, that they do have community support, they do have people who are praying for them. Another ministry that began in our church was the Homer Community Food Pantry. In the 70s, there was a closet underneath the stairs called Keith's Closet, and it was always stacked with canned goods. And anybody in town who was hungry could come by and get a bag of groceries out of Keith's Closet. And that ministry started to grow and grow. As members of the community found out about it, they would donate fish and fruits and potatoes out of their gardens, and we needed bigger space, we needed more space, we were serving more and more clients. And so the Homer Community Food Pantry was born as a separate nonprofit with its own executive director and board of directors, and now serves hundreds of clients every month. And it's a wonderful place for people in the community to be able to donate healthy food. We have chefs come in to give cooking classes. Homer has a wonderful gardening community, and we've got kale coming out our ears, and people don't always know how to cook it and eat it. And so having chefs come in to help people learn how to prepare healthy meals, especially if they're in challenging circumstances, is really an important ministry of that. So our church continues to partner with the Homer Community Food Pantry, and that's another ministry that was born from our church. Our role in the community has been to stand in the gaps. We have dozens of nonprofits in town, and even so, we still have gaps in service. We don't have a homeless shelter, we don't have a youth center, we don't have a place that kids can go after school for activities. And so part of our prayer life as a church is to be seeking where God is leading us. What gap are we called to stand in next? We don't feel like we need to keep our hands on every ministry that is born from our church. We're the midwives. We can help things, we can see things as they grow and develop, and help them grow to a healthy state, and let them blossom into their own thing, so that we can start looking for the next place that the Holy Spirit is calling us. Our nation is facing an opioid epidemic right now. I don't think there's a single part of the country that is isolated from it. And Alaska in particular is a place where opioid misuse and polysubstance abuse has become a major issue. Our governor last year declared a state of emergency about the opioid epidemic for the state of Alaska. And that's allowed us as a state to pursue grants that we can use to help on many different levels, from prevention to treatment and beyond. And we see that in Homer. It's always interesting for me to step back and try to look around and see where the Holy Spirit's stirring things up around town. And when down at the harbor master's office has a training in Narcan so that harbor workers know how to respond to an opioid overdose. When the MAP Coalition, our local nonprofit coalition, is working with the hospital and some of the other local providers on a syringe exchange program so that we can mitigate some of the harm that can be caused by sharing needles, things like preventing HIV outbreaks, preventing hepatitis outbreaks. When we see members of our own church who have family members who have died, who have family members who are struggling in the midst of abuse right now, when we have had the real challenge of trying to figure out how do you throw a baby shower for a child born with neonatal abstinence syndrome and a parent who is in the correctional facility. How do we celebrate a new life knowing that that child has been born into a place of addiction? When I hear providers in town giving community lectures on how addiction is a disease and how we need to have empathy and compassion for people who are struggling with that disease, when I see the Holy Spirit stirring up all these things in all segments of our community, that's a signal to me that our church needs to be on board with that that's where the Holy Spirit is calling us to work now at this time. And so our church has partnered with other nonprofits in town, with medical providers, and our goal is to do our part in helping mitigate the opioid epidemic through our church's Abundant Health initiative. And that looks very different. There's a lot of different levels and layers that we can pursue. You know, the basic one is how do we prevent opioid misuse? So many people, have surgery and perhaps their doctor overprescribes opioid painkillers. We're so trained as good patients to take the full dose, take the full prescription, that sometimes people aren't educated enough to know that they don't need to take their full prescription, that when their pain lessens, they need to be tapering off. Opioid misuse includes how do we dispose of prescription medications safely so they don't end up in our water system, so they don't end up in the hands of people who shouldn't have them. It's unfortunately way too easy for kids to find prescription medications in medicine cabinets and to misuse prescriptions in that way. So one level is just to educate ourselves. How do we properly take medications that were prescribed, but then how do we deal with them appropriately afterwards? How do we dispose of them? How do we be sure that they don't get into the hands of children or of people who are in the grips of this disease of addiction? Other levels that our church is working toward is to be part of our community task force facing the opioid epidemic, of getting doctors and prescribers on board to help educate the entire community about opioid misuse. Because we are an isolated community, we don't have an inpatient treatment center for drug or alcohol abuse. There are very few in our part of Alaska, and so for those who are seeking treatment, we don't have places that people can go immediately when they're ready for it. And so one of our goals, particularly through the exchange, which is the syringe exchange program, is to help get people who are in the grips of addiction connected with providers even while they're still using, so that when they're ready to make a change, they already know who to call, they already know who to ask, they already have a connection. I wish we had the resources locally to back that up, because then it also becomes a family issue. Where do the children of a person in treatment go without getting into the state foster system, which is already overloaded? And so there are parts of our coalition that are working on safe and healthy families for kids, ways that we can have safe houses for people to go to when they are in need, so that they and their families can be protected, so they can be in a safe place. I grew up in Anchorage, and just south of town there's a glacier called Portage Glacier. So when I was a kid and in the summertime, we'd come down and go fishing on the Kenai Peninsula, and we would always stop at Portage Glacier to pick up glacier ice. It's denser than normal ice, and if we filled our coolers with glacier ice, we could go to fish camp for a couple of weeks and be able to ice our fish, and the glacial ice wouldn't be melted by the time we got back to Anchorage. The glacier came right up to the parking lot. You could stand there and stare up at the face of this gorgeous glacier. Its deep turquoise color, the depths of it, it was just stunning. And there was a visitor center there that had a huge glass window, and they would show a film against a movie screen in front of that window about the science of glaciers, how glaciers are formed, how they move, how they calve icebergs, how they retreat and grow. And at the end of the film, they would raise up that movie screen, and there would be Portage Glacier right in front of you in all of its awesome majesty. If you go to Portage Glacier today, you can't see it anymore. It's still there. It has receded across its lake. It has receded across the moraine. It is now up in a valley. And if you drive around a little dirt back road and strain your neck around, you can kind of see the very foot of it. Climate change is real in Alaska. And it's real in my lifetime. In the almost 30 years that I've lived here, we've gone from being able to pick up glacial ice that has washed up into the parking lot into not even being able to see one of our closest, favorite, most beloved glaciers anymore. This is real to us in Alaska. It is a real change that we witness every day. The snowfall in winter has been so significantly different. The heat in the summer times. There have been so many ways that just in the last few decades we have seen the changes in the climate in Alaska. We know that the polar bears are facing starvation in some places because the sea ice is no longer there. Climate change is something that is very real to us because we feel it, we see it every single day in the changes in the animals' behavior for those who are living a subsistence lifestyle, from the fish and the quantity and size that are available, and from even our tourist spots where we used to be able to hike right up to the face of Exit Glacier, almost from the parking lot, and now it's a trek to get to it. So this is something that affects us very profoundly on an economic level, on a personal level, on a spiritual level, to see that God's creation is changing right in front of our eyes. Homer is an isolated community. We are at the end of the road. We're 220 miles south of Anchorage, which is the biggest city in Alaska. We are 75 miles away from our closest large grocery store. We are isolated. It's not always easy to get to town. And isolated communities can start to the isolation can really start to get to us, especially in the winter time. It's not dark 24 hours a day, but it is dark long enough that we can feel it. Seasonal affective disorder is real, and even people who don't suffer directly from SAD can certainly feel the effects of being indoors in bad weather, of not having bright sunshine during the day. Sometimes we go to work in the dark, we come home in the dark, and so cabin fever is real. And what I've noticed here in my years in Homer is sometimes an escape pressure valve is needed to deal with some of that cabin fever that starts to blow up. And in the last few years that I've been here, what I've noticed is what I've called the Homer February fights. That it seems like every February there is some issue that blows up to divide the town. And it is just the right time and place and season of the year for people to need something to keep their minds occupied as we are waiting for spring to come. And you know, in years past they've been short blow-ups that have sort of flared up and blown out immediately. This past year we did have a longer conflict that did show some, shine some light on some divisions in our town that I don't think we were all aware of. We had a resolution go before our city council that very deeply divided the town. There were a lot of people who felt like their voices have not been heard in our community in a long time. And there were other people who felt like those voices didn't need to be heard. So it was eye-opening for me as a faith leader in the community to see the level of hurt there was on both sides of the issue, of people feeling like no one was listening to them, of people feeling like their opinions didn't matter, that they weren't true residents if they didn't believe a certain way. And what I recognized more than anything was a lack of compassion, a lack of empathy, a lack of desire to listen to people of other beliefs. One of the ways our church tried to help mitigate the conflict and help the community come back together is we hosted an interfaith compassion event. We had not had interfaith work done in Homer before, yet a friend of mine who is Buddhist called me up and said, you know what we need? Our town is so divided right now. We need to get together and help people practice compassion in this challenging time. And so that became the name of our event, Practicing Compassion in Challenging Times. And we found people of faith from 7 different belief systems who came to our church and did a panel discussion for the community. Over 100 community members of all walks of life showed up to it, and the panelists were able to talk about how universal compassion is as a human need, how we need to listen to each other, have empathy for each other. And then we actually were able to put compassion in action. We had different stations of opportunities for people to practice compassion, maybe outside of their own belief system, outside their own political system, outside their own comfort zone. So one of our yoga instructors in town led a heart-opening meditation practice. And for many people who attended, it was the first time they had ever done guided meditation before. There was another member of our community who leads sacred journeys through Ireland and some of the historical sites of Celtic Christianity, and she brought a floor labyrinth that we spread out in the fellowship hall, and she taught people about walking the labyrinth and that internal journey, and then that coming back out into the world, understanding that we are all on a journey. Our church led a compassion in action activity where we had hundreds of pounds of rice and oatmeal, and we spread them all buckets and baskets and tubs all over the kitchen, and people packaged food for the food pantry. And in the course of just a couple hours, we had packaged hundreds of pounds of rice and oatmeal and soup mix, and had the food pantry well stocked for many weeks to come. So people could see that the work of their hands really did make a difference to their neighbors. Those compassion events have continued in various ways around town, and we're trying to continue to build this interfaith coalition that people of all beliefs, including atheism and agnosticism, can feel welcome to talk about those things that unite us, not just as members of the Homer community, but as members of the human race, and how we can come together and deal with conflict in a healthy way. I don't expect that there's not conflict. Conflict is part of life, but it's how we handle the conflict, how we treat our neighbors when we're in the midst of conflict that I'm passionate about. And compassion is a practice that we could all use more of.